For today's Drawing Daisies tutorial, all you will need is a fine liner pen and a pad or a piece of Stonehenge paper, or just some white sketchbook paper will work. Today's drawing tutorial is short and sweet. I suggest if you would like a more in-depth tutorial with learning sort of the basics of drawing, to going back to one of my previous drawing flowers tutorials. Those will give you a lot of tips, and we take a little bit more time in those tutorials, but this one's for if you've already practiced drawing with me before. This is sort of a next step. To start, we're going to draw a very light outline of the center of the flower, and then move on to the petals. So you can see the center is sort of a circle. It doesn't have to be perfect, of course, like I always say, nature isn't perfect, so your drawing does not have to be either. And then the petals, you can see, are these kind of long oval shapes. So remember to not put too much pressure on your pen. We want these outlines to be nice and light so that we can go back and add in the shading and have it blend really nicely into the outlines. We never want the outlines to pop. We never want them darker than the shading. So you can see here, I'm just putting sort of a little bit of pressure on my pen, just enough to make this nice light outline. For this daisy, we're going to be drawing quite a few petals. You can see that to make them look even and more natural, I'm constantly going from one side to the next to balance the flower and make sure that we don't have each petal one on top of the other on top of the other, one after another. Instead, it kind of evens out the flower, but also makes it uneven, if that makes sense. At the end of this, I'm going to probably have about 24 or so petals. I'm adding layers, so some of them will be tucked in behind the first layer of petals, and this is to just make the daisy look more full. Here's just a few little petals poking out from behind the longer ones in the front, and here's a little bit of a closer up view so you can see better. You can see the center of the daisy and then all of the petals all the way around as I add in just a few final ones. Okay, and now it's time to start our shading. The darkest part of this flower will be the center along the outside of that circle. So I'm gonna go in with these tiny little circles, each one overlapping the next, to give the center that texture while I'm also adding shading. Keep in mind, although I'm applying more pressure on my pen to get darker shading, most of the darker shadows come from layering. I'm still not pressing crazy hard on that pen because then we'll start to get too much ink on the page, and of course we can't go back. We can't erase these fine liner pens. And you can see I'm slowly working my way into the center with the outer edge still being the darkest. So I'm slowly releasing pressure on my pen the closer to the center I get. And that will start to give the center of this daisy a more rounded look. Keep on layering until you're happy with how dark your shadows are. As I've said in previous videos, previous tutorials, I really like my shadows to be dramatic, so you will see me go back here in a bit and make them even darker. But then I'm going to go right into the very center here and just do a few more, well, quite a few more of those little circles to add that texture and shading. But it's not even all the way around. Once again, we want it to look natural, like it's from nature. So I'm just going in here and there a little bit heavier, and then taking the pressure off the pen for the lighter areas. We are going to come back to the center once it's time to sort of balance it out a bit, but for now we're going to move on to shading the petals. So the darkest shadows on each petal, we're shading each of these petals individually, is closest to the center and at the very tip of the petal. We're going to use long shading lines that are very close together, that overlap, and we're going to add in darker shadows by layering those little pen strokes. We're not going to press really hard on our pen once again. All those darkest shadows come from layering the pen strokes rather than diving right in with a heavy pressure on the pen. It's really important not to leave big gaps between each of your pen strokes. That will make your shading look really separated and almost choppy. Whereas if you're layering and having each pen stroke touching and overlapping, you get this really beautiful smooth pen shading effect. So make sure you're paying attention to that as well, as you're putting just light pressure on your pen and slowly building up. You can define each petal by going in and darkening the shadows a little bit around the outline of each petal as well, but just make sure you're not just outlining it. So we don't want that outline to pop out alone, but you can emphasize it with a shadow around the edges. You can see here how I just went in and defined it a little bit more to make each individual petal stand out, but it's not the outline that stands out, it's the petal as a whole. I really like to go back and forth across the flower with my shading because this allows me to just be a little bit more even, a little bit more consistent with my shading, and make sure that the entire flower is balanced out. For some reason, I find that if I go all the way around in order of the petals, I don't always shade quite as evenly or quite as consistently, so this allows me to do so. You probably just saw that I went back into the center there and made the shadows a little bit darker. I do this a few times throughout the video as I darken the shadows on the petals because I want them to look as though they're connected to the center of the flower as well, to the center of the daisy. I want all the shading to be very consistent and in the end form one cohesive object, or in this case, one cohesive flower. Make sure that for your petals that are farther back or tucked behind the front petals, that you're making that shading just a little bit more dramatic, making those shadows deeper, and this will push the petals back and allow the top ones to come forward with the lighter shading. So just paying attention to your petal placement and going from there. You can also see how consistent and how long each pen stroke is. They reach about 1/3 of the way into the petal. So we don't want to see short little choppy pen strokes because this will make it look as though each petal is very rough and choppy rather than those nice smooth flowing petals. You can always revisit parts of your drawing. It's important to know when to stop adding shading, but if you feel as though something's not dark enough and really does need to pop out more, please feel free to go back in and fix it. You don't have to just stick to the petals or just stick to working on the center and say, that's done once you do your first sort of base coat on it. Instead, you can always go back, but you just have to be ready to say, okay, it's done. As always, I am using my UniPin Fineliner in 0.05. I also really love the 0.03 if you want to get even more tiny details in. And of course, I'm using my Stonehenge pad. I'm using my 7x7 inch one here in white. I love using the giant rolls as well. You all probably know what a big fan I am of Stonehenge paper, and I highly suggest it, although you can really work on any type of paper for these tutorials. You don't need anything fancy. And then we're just going in and finishing up the final few petals to make it one complete flower. And of course, paying attention to those shadows for the leaves that are, for the petals that are farther back. And then we can go back in and do a few touch-ups, either on the outlines, just to make each petal pop. You can either do the touch-ups on the outline, on the center, however you want to make it feel balanced. I'm even going in and adding a few more petals because I felt like there were a few areas that were a little bit sparse. And then of course, making the center even more dramatic, going in with another layer of sort of those little squiggly half dots. I'm doing them very quickly here. And touching up around those petals to give the idea of having petals behind them and a little bit more depth. And as always, we are going to sign our piece. You can add more daisies if you wish. You could make this a whole bouquet. You could add in some flowers from previous tutorials. Thank you for joining me for this week's tutorial, and I hope to see you back next time in a couple weeks. And in the meantime, check out my other tutorials.